So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. Just in case if you didn't know, my name is Zhenya Gershman, and welcome to my art studio. I love to have guests here, and not just to look at my art, but to share great ideas and be inspired. So many different things happen here, teaching, lectures, even tango dancing. So today you're not tango dancing. We have a wonderful event planned that you're about to experience. But I wanted to say a couple of words about our nonprofit. This is hosted by Project Awe. And what is Awe? Awe stands for Aesthetics of Western Esotericism. And we look at forgotten traditions and try to bring them back to light as it relates to the art, such as hidden messages in the work of Rembrandt or Dürer. And we don't claim to discover them or invent them. We simply want to bring it back, that which is forgotten, and share it back to the people the way it was meant to be shared. We do three things. We actually time travel. So we look at the works from the past, and we go deep into the past. We work with the artists, and art projects, and support fantastic exhibitions that are uplifting and inspiring. So that's working with the present. And we also work with the young artists. And that's, in our opinion, the way to work for the future, to support the arts, to support the vision for the future. So today we're going to be time traveling a little bit as well. And I just wanted to thank a few people who are helping us. We have from our board of directors, Michael Stetka. Where is he? Michael has actually traveled from San Francisco. And wait till you hear, he brought a box of wine with him, so that applause is going to wow. So thank you, Michael. He's really supportive and amazing individual. I also wanted to thank our volunteer, Pompeo Cepeda, who was greeting you today. We will also triple his applause because his job today is to, if you're interested, get you a copy of one of the books by Daniel Matt, a speaker today. They're phenomenal volumes, and there'll be a book signing. So if you want your own signed copy, Pompeo will make sure you get it. So thank you for doing that. I also wanted to take a moment to remember John Slivko. John was my dear friend, and he co-founded the organization with me. So anything that I do in the name of Awe, I take a moment to remember him. I wanted to tell you that the subject, in case you were wondering, you are here for Kabbalah, and how and who we should thank this for. And we really should go about 500 years ago and thank Albrecht Dürer, a German man, thanking him for Jewish Kabbalah lecture today. And that is because he was the one who drew me to Kabbalah. I saw some signs and Hebrew messages coded in his work. And I was even too uneducated to be able to pose a question. So I became obsessed in finding a great Kabbalah teacher. I was so obsessed that this was a few years ago. I was picking up my daughter, Nika, from her preschool art class. And the teacher was busy working with this huge mess that the 5-year-olds were making. But I was so obsessed with this question, where to find a great Kabbalah teacher that I could trust, because I wanted someone who was really, really the best in the field and trustworthy. I didn't know, I just heard myself saying, excuse me, Kathy, do you know a great Kabbalah teacher? And by the time that I finished saying that, I knew that I was pretty much, this was an insane thing to do. And she said, yes, of course, I'll give you an email of Daniel Matt. And this is how originally you got my email a few years ago. And Daniel responded right away. And he was so supportive and so helpful and put me in touch with great historical figures and some of the great academicians who helped me with my research, which did result in a published paper. And if you privately would like to know, I can tell you more about this. But now I would like to tell you a little bit more officially about Daniel. He is a teacher of Jewish spirituality and one of the world's leading authorities on Kabbalah and the Zohar. And this is very true. He has been featured in Time and Newsweek and has appeared on National Public Radio and the History Channel. He has published over a dozen books, some of this we have here today, including the Essential Kabbalah. It's translated into 8 languages. Zohar, Annotated and Explained, and God and the Big Bang, discovering harmony between science and spirituality. So those of you who are interested in science, This is a very interesting volume talking about the parallels between the two thoughts. In 2016, Stanford University Press published his nine volume of the Zohar, Pritzker Edition, concluding the Zohar's main commentary on the Torah. And this is an incredible work, respected all over the world. There is no Jewish scholar who does not have those 9 volumes on their bookshelf. For this work, Daniel has been honored with a National Jewish Book Award and a Koret Jewish Book Award. The Koret Award hailed his translation as a monumental contribution to the history of the Jewish thought. So with that thought, welcome Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you, Zhenya. It's wonderful to be here and to be exploring Kabbalah with all of you. We're going to look at some highlights from Kabbalistic teaching, and specifically on the themes of infinity, divine nothingness, and the feminine. You might say the return of the goddess within Judaism. Let me just first explain what you have in your hands. I think everyone has this. It will be good to have your own copy, or at least to be looking on with someone next to you. The front page is an artistic depiction of the 10 Sefirot, which is the main symbol system of the Kabbalah. And if you turn the page, you'll see a diagram with the English explanation of that. We'll look at this a little bit. I'm not going to go through this in great detail. Yeah, please raise your hand if you don't have it, because it's difficult enough to follow if you do have the text, and without the text, it's almost impossible. Do you have your own copy? Do you want one? Or yeah? Okay, great. So we'll spend a few minutes looking at this diagram, and we'll refer back to it. The next few pages are teachings on the theme of nothingness. This is not a statement against the divine. It's not atheism. God is actually called nothing by many mystics, both in the Jewish and Christian and in Eastern mystical traditions, and we're going to explore that a little bit. And then focus on the feminine, on Shekhinah, the feminine half of God. The last 2 pages are a description of an online Zohar course that I'm teaching, and a few of you are taking that course. I'll just say a word or two about it, but you can look on your own at that. And a new session in that course is beginning in a few weeks. So let's turn to the first page. I mean, the first page after the cover page, this diagram of the Sefirot. And I want to just start with the word Kabbalah. I like to begin by looking at the simple meaning of Hebrew words. Kabbalah, or it's sometimes pronounced Kabbalah, either way is really okay. I prefer putting the accent on the last syllable, which is how modern Hebrew usually treats words, so Kabbalah. Kabbalah comes from a root which means to receive. The Hebrew root kabel means to receive, so you could translate Kabbalah as receiving, or that which has been received. So it refers on the one hand to ancient tradition, ancient wisdom, teachings that were received from an authority. But on the other hand, it also means being receptive, putting yourself in a receptive mode. And if we're receptive, it's not so much ancient wisdom we're talking about, it's immediate wisdom we're talking about. Being open to new insights, being open to what might emerge from within your own soul, your own imagination. So it's a strange word because it combines ancient and immediate. It's ancient wisdom and it's immediate openness, what might come to you right here on the spot. So that combination of new and ancient, we'll come back to that again and again today. And in fact, the Zohar, and I want to distinguish here between Zohar and Kabbalah. People often talk about them as if they're the same thing. There's no book called the Kabbalah. If people say they're studying the Kabbalah, that really means they're studying the Zohar. So the Zohar is the main book of the Kabbalah. It's the masterpiece of the Kabbalah, which was composed in Spain in the 13th century. I'll come back to that in a moment. So Kabbalah is a name for the whole movement or the whole philosophy, and the Zohar is the major text or the masterpiece of the Kabbalah. So the Zohar actually calls its teachings new ancient words That's how it describes its teachings. The Aramaic is milin chadetin atikin, new ancient words. And we have to ask too, why would the Zohar call its teachings new and ancient? It's one thing to call them ancient, because in the Middle Ages, the older something was, the better it was, right? You didn't want to come out and say, I have an idea. People would just shoot it down. If you say, this has been taught to me and it comes from centuries ago, then it's stood a better chance of being accepted. And that's really what goes on with the Zohar. Because the Zohar emerges in Spain in the 13th century, but the person who published it, I'm using published in a general sense, we're still a few hundred years before printing, of course, the person who made the Zohar available, who copied it, said that he was copying from an ancient manuscript that went back over a millennium earlier. In other words, here we have a Kabbalistic teacher in Spain in the 13th century, a man named Moses de Leon, from Leon in northwestern Spain. And he claims he's copying from a book that went back to the 2nd century, 1100 years earlier, that was composed by a famous Talmudic rabbi, a rabbi named Rabbi Shimon the son of Yochai. And in fact, if you run into a Kabbalist today, or a Hasid, or any ultra-Orthodox Jew, and you ask him, when was the Zohar written? He or she will insist that the Zohar was written in the 2nd century, in the circle of that ancient Rabbi Shimon. Now, modern scholars have pretty much determined that it was really written by Moses de Leon in Spain in the 13th century, or by him and a circle of his Kabbalistic colleagues. So this is strange. You have somebody writing the greatest masterpiece of all of Jewish mystical literature, I would say one of the gems of world literature, and yet he doesn't come out and say that it's his own. Right? Most authors are very proud of what they've done. I was very happy that Jenya agreed to have my books here today, and authors love to sign their books and promote their books. And here we have somebody who wrote one of the masterpieces of world literature, certainly one of the greatest works of religious literature, certainly one of the gems of Jewish tradition. Many Jews consider it the holiest book in the whole Jewish canon. Now, how could something be holier than the Bible? The Bible is the holiest. Well, the Zohar is a mystical commentary on the Bible. It's not an independent book. It's not chapter 1, God, chapter 2, Torah, chapter 2, Israel, not at all. It just moves from Genesis through Deuteronomy, trying to open up a deeper spiritual meaning in the words. So that's why it's considered the holiest book, because it's showing you the deepest spiritual meaning of the holy book, of the Torah, of the Bible. So he's writing the Zohar in the 13th century, attributing it to this ancient Rabbi Shimon. Why doesn't he come out and say that he's the author? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Sorry?
Because it has to be old and...
It has to be old to be accepted. This makes it more authoritative. If he had come out and said, I have an idea, God is a woman, might not have gone over so well. But now he's saying the ancient Rabbi Shimon is teaching us that God is male and female, that there's actually a romance within God. And that's the main theme of the Zohar, that God is in love with herself, in love with him and herself. So he's writing the Zohar in Spain in the 13th century, attributing it to this ancient author, and maybe that's why he calls it new ancient words. They're being written right now, they're being invented by him, but he's presenting them as ancient. He may have actually felt that he was in touch with that ancient rabbi, that he was somehow conveying ancient wisdom. We're in an artist's studio, and any artist would say, I didn't do it, right? Jenya probably feels this sometimes. It's coming through me. I'm not the creator, I'm the vehicle, I'm the vessel, right? A poet, a musician, a sculptor, a painter often has that sense. So a true artist really is being very accurate by saying, it's not me, it's coming through me. And maybe that was going on with Moses de Leon as well. He felt something was being channeled through him, and he didn't claim it as his own. So in any case, that's how the Zohar emerges. I don't want to give a history lesson today or a history lecture, but just very briefly, how does Kabbalah emerge within Judaism? You could say we have the Bible, we have the Torah, right? And even within the Torah itself, you have a kind of mysticism, right? After all, what is mysticism? I think many of you are involved with art or spirituality, and I'm sure many of you have read mystical writings in Jewish or Christian or Sufi form or Eastern mysticism, what's really common to all mystical thought, to all mystical literature? I would say direct experience of God, or direct experience of ultimate reality. Right? The mystic isn't satisfied with simply carrying out what your tradition says, performing the religious devotions or the religious commandments. The mystic wants some direct contact with this divine source. Now, if that's what mysticism is, certainly we have that in the Bible itself. Think of Moses at the burning bush. Moses has an experience of the divine. He has a contact with divine light. If you look at the prophets, they're describing visions of God. They're having some direct experience of the divine. So certainly you have the roots of mysticism right in the Bible. The rabbis of the Talmud, we're talking now from maybe the 1st to the 6th centuries of the Common Era, they take those biblical descriptions of contact with God or mystical experience, and they try to attain that same state. They try to attain the visions that the prophets describe. What distinguishes Kabbalah about 500 or 600 years later, we're moving now from the 5th or 6th century, the Talmud, to the 11th and 12th, 13th centuries in Europe, as Jews wandered through the Mediterranean world and established themselves in Italy, France, what we call France and Germany today, the Mediterranean world. They brought these earlier biblical traditions and rabbinic traditions, and they developed techniques of meditation and a way to picture God, you might say, to describe the inner life of God. And that's what we have here. That's what's going on in this diagram. This, you might say, is a depiction of the divine qualities. You might say aspects of the divine personality. Now, it's very strange to find a picture of God. You really can't make that statement in a Jewish context. How can you depict God? The Bible says, the Torah says, don't make an image of God. Don't worship any image. So how can the Kabbalists draw a picture describing the divine qualities? Well, that brings us to the first great insight of Kabbalah, which is that God is infinity. So how you can't depict infinity, infinity is that which can't be defined. You might say infinity is the white space, and then extending off in all directions infinitely. That's the ultimate reality of God. In fact, the Kabbalah would say that all of the names that we find of God in the Bible, right, Yud-He, Vav-He, that unpronounceable name, sometimes it's pronounced Jehovah or Yahweh. Nobody really knows how it was pronounced. I usually refer to it just by naming the 4 Hebrew letters, Yud-He, Vav-He. It would be like YHVH or YHWH. That name isn't the ultimate name for God, according to Kabbalah, or Adonai, Elohim, Tsevaot, Shaddai. There's a whole list of biblical Hebrew names for God. None of them describe the infinity. They might be applied to one or another of these qualities of God. Infinity is called by the Kabbalists by a new term that they invent, namely Ein Sof. Literally, there is no end. Ein means there is not, Sof, end. So Ein Sof is there is no end or infinity. You might say that's the white space, and then extending off in all directions. That's the ultimate reality of God. So what are these 10 Sefirot? See at the bottom of the page, they're called the Sefirot. What are the Sefirot? They are aspects of the divine personality. Okay, we're not going to go through them in detail, but just a few highlights. They're often pictured as a human body, a divine human body. Look at the very first one is called Keter, a crown on the head. The next two would be the head, Chokhmah, wisdom, Bina, understanding. So divine wisdom, divine understanding, you might think of them almost as the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And there are actually some correspondences between what neuroscience tells us about right and left hemispheres and how the Zohar describes Chokhmah and Bina. So Chokhmah and Bina, wisdom and understanding, would be the divine mind, the divine intellect. Then we come to the right and left arms. Chesed, meaning love, on the right. Gevurah, meaning power, on the left. Tiferet is the harmony of those two opposites. Tiferet, literally beauty, but I think better understood as harmony. Harmonizing the right and the left. Netzach and Hod, the next two, the right and left legs. Yesod, the phallus. Malchut, the vagina, or the feminine in general. The goal of this system is to unite the masculine and the feminine. Tiferet in the middle would be the masculine, literally beauty, but called Rachamim, compassion, or the Blessed Holy One. That's the central masculine entity. And Malchut, the last of the 10, I'm going to refer to her more as Shekhinah. Shekhinah is the name for the divine feminine. So the goal of this whole system, the goal of life, according to Kabbalah, is to unite the male and female. Which to bring together these two halves of God. These are only 2 out of the 10 Sefirot, but they're the main 2 when the Zohar describes what's going on in the divine world. If you live a righteous life, if you act virtuously, if you act ethically, spiritually, you are uniting Tiferet, the masculine, with Shekhinah, the last of the 10 Sefirot. Their union is what you're meant to do in this world. Let's focus just for a moment on Chesed and Gevurah. That Chesed on the right, love, and Gevurah, power, on the left. Because this is a good example of how the Sefirot are not just divine qualities, they're also characteristics of the human being, of the human psyche. Think of love and power as 2 opposites. And in fact, another name for power is, that I didn't write down here, is pachad, the Hebrew word for fear. Think of love and fear. It's easy to imagine those as 2 opposite feelings, 2 opposite emotions, right? The love you might feel for someone, the fear you might fear from someone. Sometimes you feel love and fear about the same person, right? Being open to another person, loving another person, and maybe being somewhat anxious or scared or terrified of actually bearing yourself to another person. So you can imagine feeling both love and its opposite at the same time. Kabbalah would say the goal is to balance love and awe, if I can use that word in this setting. Love and awe, or love and fear, also called here power, also called judgment. You could think of it this way. Love by itself would be too much to bear. It might be love that would drown you, or love that would smother you. Right? Think of a situation in your life or a relationship in your life where you were receiving or giving too much love, where the recipient couldn't handle the amount of love that was being given. That would be an example of love without any limitation, without any definition or boundary. So you could say Chesed on the right is pure love, Gevurah on the left is definition or boundary or a way to channel that love, a way to convey that love. In other words, Chesed by itself would be too much, and obviously constriction or boundary by itself would be too much. That would squeeze out all the love. But if the love can be conveyed in a positive, bearable way, then we end up at that middle sphera of Tiferet, which is really, I think, best understood as by its other name, Rachamim. Rachamim is the Hebrew word for compassion. So that middle sphera, Tiferet, is actually called Rachamim. So what's the difference between love and compassion? Love doesn't take into account how much the other person can handle. Compassion is giving love in a way that respects where the other person is at. So you could say compassion is love that has successfully moved through that sphera on the left, through power, through control, through definition, boundary, limitation. So that's a beautiful example of how the Sefirot are describing divine qualities, but also what's going on inside of us. These are a description of the divine being, of the divine dynamics, but they're also a kind of medieval spiritual psychology. This is really an early form of psychology. And we have to remember, of course, psyche, the root of psychology is psyche, meaning the soul. Psychology was a spiritual science. Okay? And probably some of you are involved in therapy or psychology in one form or another. There's certainly a spiritual side even to modern psychology, and in the ancient world, the medieval world, that was all the more so. Kabbalah is theology and psychology both at the same time. We'll see examples of that. What I want to focus on right now for a few minutes is the very first Sephirah, not its official name, Keter, but its more interesting name, Ayin. Look over to the right of that first Sephirah. You'll see the literal meaning is crown. Keter means crown, so it's a crown on the head of this divine organism. And remember, this is an androgynous body. This is male and female. So this is a crown on the head of that divine body. It's also called will, the divine will. But its most interesting name is the next term, Ayin. The Hebrew word Ayin, actually there are two Hebrew words that are both pronounced Ayin. One means the eye, but the one I'm interested in here is spelled with an aleph, aleph, yud, nun. Those of you who know Hebrew, Ayin means nothing. I don't mean that it doesn't mean anything. It means literally nothing, or nothingness. That is a name for the highest of all the divine qualities. Now that sounds very strange. How can you call the ultimate level of God nothing? It sounds like you're putting it down. It sounds like you're denying it. It sounds like atheism. But this is not a statement of atheism. This is really, I think it's better pronounced no thing. God is no-thingness. You might say God is the energy that animates everything, but can't be identified as any one thing. That's what the Kabbalah means by calling God by this paradoxical name, Ayin. We find this in Christian mysticism too. Meister Eckhart, the great Christian mystic, calls God nicht when he's writing in German. And when he's writing in Latin, he calls God nihil, right, as an annihilate, nihilism. God is called nihil or nicht by one of the great Christian mystics. He has the same thing in mind. God is no thing. God is beyond anything we can describe. John of the Cross, the great Christian mystic, writing in Spanish, calls God what? In Spanish. How do you say nothing?
Nada.
Nada. That's his name for God, nada. He has the same thing in mind. The ultimate reality of God can't be put into words, so it's better to use a negative description. Let's turn to the next page and you'll see a few examples of this. I'm just going to run through a few of these quickly and we'll have time for discussion a little bit later. The first few this is on officially page 1, but you have it at the top. It says Ayin. There you have the Hebrew word, Ayin, nothingness or no-thingness. We're starting here with some statements by early mystical philosophers. Number 1, God is the cause of being for all, but is itself non-being, for it is beyond all being. Okay, he doesn't come out and call God nothing. This is Pseudo-Dionysius, a Christian mystic. He says God is beyond what you could call being. Now he's not saying that God doesn't exist, but God exists in a way that's different from our existence. You might say God is essential being. But now we come to another mystic, John Scotus Erigena. He lived in Ireland, a Christian mystic, the 9th century. Number 2, because of the ineffable, incomprehensible, and inaccessible brilliance of the divine goodness, it is not improperly called nothing. You can actually call the ultimate reality of God nothing because it can't be accessed. It can't be comprehended. Let's skip for a moment. Let's skip to number 4. Here we come to Kabbalah itself. Ayin, nothingness, is more existent than all the being of the world. But since it is simple, and every simple thing is complex, compared with its simplicity, it is called Ayin. Okay, this is one of the first mystics who applies this term to God. God exists even more than everything else exists, but it's simpler. It's simpler than compound being. Anything in the world is a compound. God is pure being, so he chooses this paradoxical way of referring to God as nothing. Or look at the next. The inner power is called Ayin because thought does not grasp it, nor reflection. There's no way to imagine, there's no way to wrap our mind around God, so it's better to use negative language. Maimonides had said this. The great Jewish philosopher Maimonides said, it's better to say what God is not than what God is. Because if you say what God is, your words are never going to do justice to God. It's better to say what God is not. God is not limited. God is not finite. If you say God is great, that makes God seem like some superhero. If you say God is wise, that makes God seem like some professor. Though most professors aren't that wise. So don't use positive language. Maimonides says use negative language. Negative in a certain, very specific sense. The mystics just take that a little further and say we're going to use the ultimate negative language. We're going to say God is nothing. But it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It means God is beyond anything we can imagine. Now look what they quote. How can you prove this from the Bible? They find a verse in the book of Job concerning this. Job said, "V'hachochma me'ayin timatzeh." Now in the book of Job, that really means wisdom. Chochma is wisdom. Wisdom, where is it found? It's a rhetorical question in Job. In other words, where can you locate wisdom? Well, how can you there's no way to locate wisdom. Wisdom is here. I'll get it, I'll grab it, I'll put it in my pocket, I have wisdom. No. Wisdom, where can you find it? Where can you locate it? So it's a rhetorical question. But the Hebrew word ayin can mean where, or it can mean nothing. The same word in Hebrew can be a question word, where, or it can mean nothing. So in the Bible, it's meant as a question. V'hachochma, wisdom, me'ayin, from where? From where is it found? The mystics say, don't read it as if it means where, read it as if it means nothing. Wisdom comes into being out of Ayin. Wisdom emerges from Ayin. So look back at the chart for a moment. How are they understanding it? Just flip the page. Wisdom, the Sphira number 2, emerges from Keter, from Ayin. That's how they read the verse in Job. Wisdom comes into being from that higher divine quality known as nothingness. Okay, let's look at one more, number 6, before we turn the page. I'm still on page 1, number 6. This is from, look down at footnote number 6. This is by Moses de Leon. This is by the author of the Zohar. This isn't from the Zohar, but it's written by that 13th century Spanish Kabbalist who composed the Zohar. This is from one of the books that he admits having written. Okay, this is a Hebrew book that he wrote about Kabbalah. He says, I, Moses de Leon, wrote this book in Guadalajara, Spain, that is. In the year, he dates the book, he says where he wrote it, when he wrote it, and in his books he sometimes quotes from the Zohar. So that's interesting. He's admitting that he's the author of the Hebrew book, and he quotes from the Zohar. How does he refer to the Zohar? He's referring to his own masterpiece, right? But he can't say it's from my book, because he wants people to believe it's from Rabbi Shimon, who lived 1,100 years earlier. So when he quotes from the Zohar, what does he say? As the ancient ones have said. And then he'll bring a little bit of Zohar and translate it from Aramaic to Hebrew. So here he's not quoting the Zohar, but he's describing Ayin. Arouse yourself to contemplate, to focus thought. For God is the annihilation of all thoughts, uncontainable by any concept. Indeed, since no one can contain God at all, it is called Ayin, nothingness. This is the secret of the verse. He quotes the same verse. Many Kabbalists quote this verse from Job. Wisdom comes into being from Ayin. Anything sealed and concealed, totally unknown to anyone, is called Ayin, meaning that no one knows anything about it. Similarly, no one knows anything about the human soul. She stands in the status of nothingness. So this is interesting. He's saying God, God is nothingness, and within ourselves we also have a taste of nothingness. It's not just a divine quality. We can taste this nothingness. There's something indefinable. There's something infinite within each of us. We think that we're limited beings, but we actually have access to something boundless within the soul. As it is written, now here he quotes from Ecclesiastes. This book, Ecclesiastes, I'm sure many of you have read it. It's one of the most striking books in the whole Bible. It's a very cynical book. It's unlike any other book in the Bible. It says, everything is vain, everything is futile. You're going to live and then you're going to die. What's it all about? Other books say that if you act justly, you'll be rewarded. If you act wickedly, you'll be punished. Ecclesiastes says, what's the difference? Good people, bad people? They're not judged according to what they've done. Good people die and bad people prosper. It's the most challenging book, along with Job, in the whole Bible. But he quotes a verse, and look what he does. He turns it on its head. The verse in Ecclesiastes says, the superiority of the human over the beast is nothing. That's what it says in Ecclesiastes. What do we have over animals? Nothing. We're just an animal. There's nothing better about being human than being an animal. Where would you find that in the Bible? Only in this book. But Moses the Lamb doesn't believe that. He believes there's something special about being human. So how does he read the verse? The superiority of the human over the being is Ayin. We have access to this mystical nothingness. It's a beautiful example of how the mystics reread the Bible. You could say they subvert the Bible. One literary critic has called this creative betrayal. Okay, they're taking the verse and just turning it upside down. You see what's going on here? The verse says we have nothing over the animals. He says we have nothing over the animals. We have access, we can attain that state of mystical, divine no-thingness just by meditating. If we look within, if we stop the busyness of our mind, we can contact that ineffable, infinite quality that's given this beautiful paradoxical name, no-thingness. Yeah?
This sounds a lot like Buddhism.
It's very close to Buddhism, and that reminds us that all mystics basically end up at the same place. They get there on a different path. He's getting there through studying the Torah, through meditating on Jewish concepts and symbols, but this thing of nothingness, what's called in Buddhism shunyata, emptiness, is very, 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 very similar.
And meditation. And the meditation too.
Sure, definitely. It's really the place where you find the bridge between all religions, is the mystical stream. Okay, let's turn the page and we'll see here a few examples of how this now becomes an experiential reality. First, number 7, the Hebrew word ani. The Hebrew word ani is spelled with the same letters as Ayin. Aleph, Nun, Yud in Hebrew spells ani, which means I, the ego, the self. If you just switch around 2 of those letters and read it Aleph, Yud, Nun, you get Ayin, nothingness. So some of the Hasidic teachers said, take your ego, take your ani, yourself, and meditate on that, switch the letters around, melt, dissolve the ego into this ocean of infinity, into Ayin. Now this doesn't mean that you lose yourself totally. I would say it's more dipping into this bath, this ocean of infinity, and then emerging renewed, rejuvenated. Emerging with yourself, but now in a new way. Look at number 8. This really relates to this idea. These are all from Hasidic teachings. Hasidism is what? Hasidism is a revivalist movement in Judaism that began in the 18th century Europe. It really takes the ideas of Kabbalah and tries to spread them to the masses. It's really a popularization of the Kabbalah. Now we think of Hasidism as ultra-Orthodox, as the most conservative, fundamentalist branch in Judaism. When it began, it was a radical revivalist movement, and the Hasidim were actually excommunicated by the Orthodox of the day because the Orthodox felt they were being too spontaneous, too wild, too mystical. So here they reflect on this Kabbalistic idea of Ayin. Ayin, number 8, Ayin is the root of all things. And when one brings anything to its root, one can transform it. First, each thing must arrive at the level of Ayin. Only then can it become something else. Ayin strips off one form and puts on another. Transformation is possible only through Ayin. So the goal isn't to melt into Ayin and totally dissolve. The goal is to, for a moment, let go of your current image of self and discover a new possibility, a new identity. It's dipping into this ocean of nothingness and re-emerging. Really as a plant or as a seed has to destruct in order to germinate. And that's really what he's applying that to how the self can be transformed. Let's look at number 10. The essence of serving God and of all the mitzvot is to attain the state of humility, namely to understand that all your physical and mental powers and your essential being depend on the divine elements within. You are simply a channel for the divine qualities. Right? If you have a certain talent, if you have a certain ability, if you've achieved something, don't be proud of it. Realize that you're conveying something beyond yourself. What we said before about art, about creativity, here he's applying that really to any talent, anything you do. Don't claim it as your own. What you're really doing is channeling these divine attributes, these divine energies. We are in the image of the divine. So don't be fooled into thinking that if you achieve something, it's really your own, that you own it, that it's totally the product of your own being. You're a vessel, you're a vehicle for something transcendent. You're simply a channel for the divine qualities. You attain this humility through the awe of God's vastness, through realizing that there is no place empty of God. It's a line from the Zohar. There's no place empty of God. Then you come to the state of Ayin, the state of humility. It's interesting. He calls Ayin, which means nothingness, he's equating that with humility. You don't usually think of humility as a mystical state, but for him this is a mystical humility. It's not putting yourself down. It's saying, I am simply a channel for something beyond me. So for him, it's a more honest way to think of your own qualities, of your own beauty. Don't think that your own beauty is really yours. You're expressing something greater than yourself. And that can lead you both to an ethical humility and a mystical humility. You have no independent self and are contained, as it were, in the Creator. This is the meaning of the verse. Now again, we're going to find a radical reinterpretation of a verse from the Bible. Moses hid his face, for he was in awe. Where is that from? Exodus chapter 3, describing, anyone know? Yes, Moses at the burning bush. Right? Moses sees this bush burning, and it's not consumed. He's overwhelmed. He's filled with awe, and he hides his face. Okay, he can't look at it. It's too powerful. It's unbearable. But how does he interpret it? Moses hid his face. Through his experience of awe, Moses attained the hiding of his face. It's not that he hid his face, it's that he lost his personality. His personality melted into the divine personality. You could say he was effaced. His face, his personality just melted into the divine oneness. He perceived no independent self. So what happened to Moses at the burning bush? He had a mystical experience. He became aware that he was part of God. That's how he interprets he hid his face. Okay, now the author knows that he hid his face means he hid his face, but he's willing to creatively refashion the verse and apply it to this mystical state. Everything was part of divinity. Okay, let's look at one more about Ayin, and then we'll turn to the divine feminine. Number 11. When reciting the first line of the Shema is one of the central prayers of all of Jewish teaching. I'm sure many of you know it by heart. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Probably that originally meant the Lord is one, there's one God. Right? It's a statement of monotheism. But look how he interprets it. Hear, O Israel, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, our God. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is one. When you recite that line, you should intend that there is nothing in the world but God. You should consider yourself to be absolute Ayin. Your essence is only the soul within, part of God above. Thus only God is. This is the meaning of the word one. So how is he taking one? He's really reading it, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is oneness. God is the oneness of it all. It's no longer a statement affirming monotheism, it's a statement affirming mysticism. God is the oneness of it all. So the central prayer of Judaism now becomes a mystical affirmation. Any questions on this itself before we go to Shekhinah, the feminine? Yeah.
Chris, you're doing this and you're pulling out, you understand that there are lots of different ways to interpret the Shema, and you're giving us the one here to line it up. And some could see it as a declaration of independence. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. I am the Lord your God, broke out of my vision. There are lots of other gods, but I'm yours. So you could take it as...
It might have meant that originally, or it may mean, it also might mean, the God who is our God is the one God. Other people might call it by different names, but ultimately it's the one God. It's a strange line, and it's in the Torah and the book of Deuteronomy. It's not totally clear what the simple meaning is. The simple meaning, I'm sure, is not this meaning. He's giving it a new mystical meaning. So we know for sure that's not what the Torah had in mind. Maybe it means there's only one God. Maybe it means God is unique. Maybe it means the God who's our God is the one God. Other people might call him by other names, or other people might not be aware of him. It's not clear what it means, but he's giving it a new meaning. Right? The rabbis do that too. The rabbis take the Torah and interpret it in new ways. Judaism is not really the Torah. Judaism is what the rabbis did to the Torah, because they had to update it, they had to revise it. And that really happens in every religious tradition, right? Unless a tradition constantly reinterprets itself, it dies, because times change and people change. So what we see here is one later reinterpretation of that verse. Okay, let's focus on Shekhinah. Did you have a question? Yeah.
So ever since learning math, actually, this idea of 0 and 1 and infinity cross-linking with each other.
Yes, that's so interesting.
Is 1 over 0 equals infinity, 0,
right.
Like these kinds of things.
Yes, 0 is such a unique number.
All three of those numbers are actually
1 and 0 and infinity.
Well, 1, 0, and infinity.
Yeah.
And so to have it here said again, this is just magnifies my ultimate human confusion about the equivalence of nothing and one, because that's what this really says, is that God equals ultimate 0 or nothing. It isn't 0, actually, it's nothing. And that nothing, God also equals the ultimate 1, which would suggest that 0 equals 1, or nothing equals 1. And then I get perfectly twisted. I don't know.
Yeah.
If you think of it, I'm thinking of it as an artist. If you think of a 0 as an actual journey, it's not empty, it's actually a continuous journey. And 1 is an uprightness connecting the lower and the upper. So if you think of 0 and 1 as a painter, as a, forget its meaning, but an actual symbol, it kind of gives a different sense.
And just the shape of the 0. The 0 is inclusive. So it's everything. It symbolizes nothing, but it's including everything you can imagine.
And that nothing doesn't equal 0 in this case either.
Yeah, right. It's mind-boggling. I mean, it's an example of how for mysticism and I think for art, that the rational mind will get you up to the last point, and then there has to be a certain surrender. But you can't understand this stuff unless you employ your rational mind. But ultimately, the rational mind won't be able to grasp it because of the nature of the beast. Yeah.
So, since we are an artist studio, can you tell me if there are any colors associated with this?
With the Sefirot, there definitely are. There's not agreement among the Kabbalists on all the colors, but a few of them that are more common are Chesed, this triad of Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet, that middle triad that we spoke about psychologically, love and power, or love and judgment, love and control, and harmony. Love is white. And actually, I think that's noted here. It's hard to find it. There's so many associations. Love is white, right? The purity of love. Gevurah on the left, the color is red. You think of red, and Mars is red blood, war, power, judgment, harshness. Tiferet isn't pink, it's not white and red combined, but green, because green is the most harmonious color. So green, Tiferet being harmony, is symbolized by green. Shekhinah is sometimes pictured as black, like it's all of the colors combined, but also blue as the blue of the sky. Those are the most common color associations.
And Keter?
Keter, perhaps also white, a white that's even more pure than the white of Chesed. Yeah, please.
So is this, speaking about the diagram, it's also referred to as the tree of life?
This is often called the tree of life, yeah, and if it's a tree of life, it's really an upside down tree. Keter is the root, and sometimes called the root of roots. So this tree is branching out. God, you could say, is growing or evolving, and it doesn't stop here. God then flows and becomes the world.
And is it also used as a sort of conception of the levels that people reach in learning and
Yes.
understanding?
It's a ladder of ascent. It's how God flows and becomes the world, and it's a spiritual path of ascent, something that's described as a ladder. So you would imitate these qualities, or Shekhinah is the beginning of the contact with the divine presence in the world, we'll see in a moment. So that she's the gateway to these various qualities. And then the very highest ones would be really, each one would be a focus of meditation, but the highest ones especially being the mind or the divine intellect, a focus of meditation. Bina especially, Bina is described as the divine mother. It's another feminine. Chokhmah on the right is father near the top, Bina on the left, mother. And Bina gives birth to these 7 lower sfirot. Shekhinah could be seen as her daughter, mother and daughter. Yeah. I'll come back another time and we'll focus specifically on meditation and text on meditation. Please.
Maybe I'm wrong, but it reminds me of the ancient theory of Chinese related to Chinese medicine, the theory of 5 elements. And it's the 5 elements of the earth, wood, fire, water. And the relationship between these 5 elements of mother, son, son, mother relationship, the same absolutely theory. And is it only I feel this way, or it's known connection between the theory of 5 elements and
Kabbalah often speaks of, those 5 are often seen as 4, and then an additional one. The 4 are earth, air, fire, and water, and those are related to the sfirot. Shekhinah is earth, Tiferet is air, Gevurah, power, is fire, and Chesed is the flowing emanation, is water. So water, fire, air, and then Shekhinah. Those you do find.
There is Shem, it's everything.
Yeah, you can relate them, and the Kabbalah definitely does sometimes relate. Let me take one more question, then I want to move to Shekhinah. I'll take 2 more questions, and then Shekhinah. Yeah.
If I understand you correctly, the only ultimate reality is the nothing that's God, and it's everywhere, and our ultimate reality is nothing in us. If that's true, doesn't it approach pantheism?
Doesn't it approach pantheism? Yeah, pantheism is pantheos, all is God. Some scholars say we shouldn't call this pantheism, all is God, but panentheism. Scholars love to make these, very fine distinctions that don't always hold up. But panentheism means what? Panentheos, all is within God. So God is somehow greater than the sum of the parts, but everything participates in the divine or is contained in the divine, and then maybe still there's a transcendent aspect of God which can't be identified with anything we might find in the world. So there are pantheistic elements in Kabbalah, or panentheistic, definitely, more so in Hasidism. You definitely can find some pantheistic elements. It's very different than the biblical description, which seems to be God separate from nature. This is God animating nature. So it's a mystical rereading of the tradition. Yeah.
So when you spoke about Ayin, and you said that the best way to describe it is in terms of negative language. As to say it.
It's not.
A little louder, please. Yeah.
The best way to describe it would be in negative language.
Right.
Say, to describe it in terms of what it is not as opposed to what it actually is.
Yeah.
Um,
Because words are inadequate for describing the divine.
would it be fair to conceptualize that as what human imagination is yet to come up with? And so that therefore there would be a gap between the two. And it would be sort of like a marriage between what's deductive and what we know about, and but still leaving space for what's inductive.
Like Einstein. Like Einstein when he predicted things that he couldn't test, but he sensed that they would come. Right? So if you-
Yeah, well, so like maybe from a musician's point of view,
Uh-huh.
when we're playing together and we're playing improvised music,
Right.
we all know the harmony, we all know the possibilities for that harmony, but whatever is going to happen in every moment is what our imagination is.
Even though you couldn't verbalize it, but you're feeling it, and it emerges as something beyond normal expression.
Yeah, and you could
Uh-huh.
quantify it in hindsight. I mean, you could sit there and figure out all the theories and
Right.
fanaticism that
Yeah.
would entail it, but the gap between that place, which is present, and what is nothing, would be on the other side of imagination.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good parallel. Yeah, and the Zohar says that God would be totally inaccessible were it not for the imagination. Imagination opens up the possibilities. Okay, let's turn to the material in Shekhinah. We're going to begin this material, and even the video will end before we complete this. I'll go on teaching, but the video will catch a good part of this material in Shekhinah. So page 4, Shekhinah. This, I think, is perhaps one of the greatest contributions of the Kabbalah, to balance the patriarchal description of God with the feminine. Right? Really, in all Western religion, God is overwhelmingly male. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, it's very hard to find a clear description of God as feminine. You could find a phrase, an image in the prophet Jeremiah or the prophet Isaiah. Sometimes a poetic theologian might speak about God as compassionate mother, but it's very, very rare, very unusual. The Kabbalah says God is equally male and female. Ultimately, God is Ein Sof, God is infinite, and that's certainly beyond gender. But the Zohar, the Kabbalah insists that if you're going to describe God, you have to balance the masculine with the feminine, and that's incorporated in this word Shekhinah. One way to remember that Shekhinah is feminine is to look at the first 3 letters of the name. Okay? She. Shekhinah is the divine she. And in terms of the Sfirot, she is the last of the 10 Sfirot. Her official Kabbalistic name, again, is Malchut, kingdom, but she's often referred to as Shekhinah. And remember, the goal of the system is to marry Shekhinah with her masculine spouse, with her masculine partner. So I said that Ein Sof was invented by the Kabbalists. Before Kabbalah, nobody in Jewish tradition ever called God infinity or Ein Sof. Shekhinah is different. Shekhinah is very prominent in the Kabbalah, but she also appears very frequently in earlier rabbinic literature. And we'll see, look at an example of this, number 1. There's no place empty of Shekhinah. That's a typical statement in rabbinic literature. So we're talking now 4th century, 5th century, 800 years, 900 years before the Zohar. The rabbis are talking about Shekhinah. Now the question is, do they really picture her as feminine? Now every noun in Hebrew is either masculine or feminine. Unlike English, where almost most nouns have no gender, in Hebrew every noun has gender. And Shekhinah, almost every word that ends with ah, is feminine. Shekhinah is a feminine noun. So you could say Shekhinah is feminine, but never in the Talmud or the Midrash, never in a rabbinic text, do you find any discussion of Shekhinah being married to her divine partner. Shekhinah is somehow God pictured in somewhat feminine way, but not in a romantic way of husband and wife. So what does Shekhinah mean for the rabbis? God's presence in the world. There's no place on earth empty of the divine presence. Don't think that God is just up there. God's presence fills the world. That's a typical statement about Shekhinah in the Talmud. Again, this is before the Kabbalah. This is good standard rabbinic Judaism. Number 2, wherever Israel went in exile, Shekhinah was with them. So this is a little different. It's not God's presence in nature. It's God's intimacy with the Jewish people. If Israel is exiled to Babylon, Shekhinah is with them. So the idea seems to be, don't think that God has abandoned you. There's an aspect of God that is still with you. And here it does seem like it's almost the comforting, motherly presence. So there's some sense in which Shekhinah is beginning to take on a motherly feel, but again, there's not a romance within God. Number 3, happy are the righteous, for they cause Shekhinah to dwell on earth. That's interesting. Now that's also strange because we said Shekhinah does dwell on earth. Shekhinah fills the world. So why do you need a righteous person to cause Shekhinah to dwell on earth? Shekhinah is on earth. But you might say this is the goal, this is the task of being righteous, to welcome God into the world. It's as if God is potentially in the world. God is potentially in the world, but unless we act ethically, unless we act spiritually, we exclude God from the world. It's up to us to really make a home for the divine. Otherwise, God is excluded from our lives. Yeah.
What does Shekhinah mean?
Mashkin is the verb from that same root shachan. So to make a dwelling place. Means to cause to dwell. To cause to dwell.
So those two words together.
Those who are righteous cause Shekhinah to dwell. Mashkin et Shekhinah.
Those are not, and it's the same root.
No, yes, the same root. Or is it the root Shekhinah really literally means God's dwelling in the world. You find it very often in modern Hebrew. Shachen means neighbor. Shechunah means neighborhood. Mashkanta means mortgage. So that root shachan is very, very common, and already you find it in the Torah too. You don't find the name Shekhinah in the Torah, but you find this root shachan. For example, the Mishkan, right? The Mishkan is God's dwelling, the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary the Israelites carried as they wandered through the desert. It's called the Mishkan. The M is just a prefix. Mishkan is God's dwelling place. Shekhinah you find for the first time in the rabbinic literature, and it still means, has the same meaning, God's dwelling in the world. Okay, number 4. When Rav Yosef heard his mother's footsteps, he would say, I will arise before Shekhinah, who is approaching. Now this is interesting. This is almost the only time in all rabbinic literature that Shekhinah is clearly feminine, because what's this rabbi doing? Whenever his mother came into the room, he said, I have to get up because the Shekhinah is coming into the room. So for him, his mother was what? His mother was an embodiment of the Shekhinah. His mother was an embodiment of the divine presence. So for him, there is clearly a feminine quality to Shekhinah. There's still not a romance within God, but Shekhinah is, you could say, God as mother. Okay, now we're ready for passage from the Zohar. Maybe for some of you, this is the first passage you've ever seen from the Zohar. We've been reading various things, but not from the Zohar itself. So I just have to give you one or two little words of preface here. First of all, we've been talking about Shekhinah as the feminine. Now we're moving from rabbinic literature, where Shekhinah is the divine presence, to the Zohar, where she's the actual feminine half of God. So the notion here seems to be God is male and female. We have to unite the two. How do we unite the two? By acting ethically. If we perform the mitzvot, if we perform the commandments of the Torah, we stimulate the divine romance. What I would say is every good deed is an aphrodisiac for the divine romance. we have to stimulate the love between Shekhinah and her masculine partner. And we do that by acting ethically in the world. So it's up to us to make God one. We come here back to that sense of, is God one? God is one, but the Kabbalah would say God is potentially one. God doesn't really become one unless we unify God. We have to unite these separate halves of the divine. So the question is really, where is the Kabbalah getting this from? How can they come out and say God is feminine? You don't have that in the Bible. You don't have that in the Talmud, clearly, overtly, that God is feminine. Where are they getting it from? It must be an ancient notion of the feminine goddess now returning to Judaism. When Jenny and I were first talking about this presentation, about my talk, because of the work you do and because of this theme of recovering ancient myth, that's really what's going on here with Shekhinah. The Kabbalists are recovering the ancient notion of the goddess and bringing it back to Judaism. It's a very striking, radical, almost heretical move. Because if you look at the Bible, it's not only that you don't have God as feminine, the Bible is out to eliminate the feminine. Because we know in the ancient world there was a goddess. There was a goddess who was alive and well in Canaan, in Canaanite religion. And the biblical authors are trying to eliminate the goddess, maybe for very good reasons. Maybe because there were orgiastic rites, maybe there was child sacrifice. We don't know all of what was going on in Canaanite religion, but we know there was a goddess. There was a god, and there was a goddess. She goes by various names: Anat, Asherah, Astarte. She's called by various names, and you find her name occasionally in the Bible. Cut down every tree that's been planted for Asherah, for the goddess. So we know there were some Israelites who were worshiping the goddess, and the prophets are condemning that worship. But it's even more interesting than that. There were some Israelites who wanted to worship the true God, Yud-He Vav-He, right, the God of Israel, along with the goddess. They wanted to combine the worship of the masculine God of Israel with the goddess. How do we know that? Because archaeologists have found inscriptions, I'm offering this prayer to Yud-He Vav-He and his Asherah. Combining Yud-He Vav-He with the Canaanite goddess. So the biblical authors are trying to get rid of that. They successfully eliminate the goddess from Judaism. And what do we have in Kabbalah? The reemergence of the goddess. Sholem, the great scholar Gershom Sholem, he calls this the revenge of myth. The revenge of myth. That myth which had been almost totally eliminated now comes back right in the heart of rabbinic Judaism. You might say in a more popular sense, the goddess has become kosher. That's really what's happening with Shekhinah. Okay, for this verse, for this teaching of the Zohar, look at number 5. It starts with a verse from the Torah. He drove out et ha'adam. He drove out Adam. Okay, a few of you know Hebrew here. Look at the Hebrew number 5 on the right, or just follow the English. The first word, vayigaresh, means he drove out. The next word is a little 2-letter Hebrew word, et, spelled aleph taf. And that means nothing. I don't mean like Ayin, it means nothingness. It means nothing. It doesn't have any meaning. It's very strange you would have a word that doesn't have any meaning, but in Hebrew, this word is just a marker for the direct object. In Hebrew, you can't say, I drink the water. You have to say, I drink et the water. That's this little word, et. It's spelled et, aleph, in Hebrew, aleph taf. You can't say, I see the light. You have to say, I see et the light. If you don't have the word the, if you don't have the definite article, you don't need et. Ani shoteh mayim. I drink water. You don't need the et. But I drink the water. Ani shoteh et hamayim. So if you have the object and the definite article the, you need et. Now there's something else very interesting about et. How is it spelled? What are the 2 Hebrew letters? Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet. Taf, the last letter of the alphabet. So it has the entire alphabet. You could say it spans everything, and it means nothing. This is too good for a rabbi to pass up. And the rabbis who love to interpret et Even though the word means nothing, it seems to be pregnant with meaning. So some rabbis in the Talmud said if you find the word et, you're allowed to interpret it. For example, in the Torah it says, et ha-Elohim. You should revere et ha-Elohim. You should revere God. But it says you should revere et God. So one rabbi said, this means you should also revere your rabbi. Get a little bit of self-interest there. But what his point is, the word et adds some meaning to the verse. So that was very popular in the Talmud, although some rabbis in the Talmud said, this is crazy, enough with you and your ets. Because if you interpret every et, you can imagine how many times the word et comes in the Torah, almost every verse. Wherever there's a direct object with a definite article, you have et. In fact, the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, he had a campaign against et. He wrote letters to the editor, letters to the editor of newspapers saying, let's eliminate et. Why are we spilling valuable printer's ink on this word that means nothing? And he tried to write and speak without the word et. I realize our video is about to end, so I'll just say that Shekhinah is probably the great contribution of the Zohar. And if we have to end the video, I want to continue this beyond. How much time is there left? You have time still? Okay, great. 20. Great. Okay, so this word et does survive in modern Hebrew, despite David Ben-Gurion. There's less appearance of the word et in modern Hebrew compared to classical Hebrew, but he wasn't successful in eliminating it completely. Just one other thing, let me finish this passage and then I'll be happy to take the question. So one thing we have to know is this word et. In the Zohar, et comes to mean something very specific. Et is a code name for Shekhinah. Why? Because look back to the diagram. She contains all of the preceding sfirot. In fact, you could say Keter is Aleph. So you might think, okay, maybe Shekhinah is Taf. No, Shekhinah is Aleph to Taf, because she contains all of the preceding sfirot. She's the totality of the divine, so she is given the name Et in the Zohar. And that will apply to the passage we're going to look at. The only other thing we need to know before we read this passage is that the verb to drive out in Hebrew, the garesh, can also mean to divorce. And some rabbis had already interpreted this verse, he drove out Adam, to mean that God divorced Adam. It's as if God and Adam were married. Adam had such an intimate closeness with God, it's as if they were a married couple, but because Adam disobeyed the divine command, what do Adam and Eve do? They eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Because of that, Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. The rabbi said that means he divorced Adam, not he drove Adam out. Okay, let's see what the Zohar does with this thing. Since I said you can't say I drink the water, it's I drink et the water, so I say that. So, page 4, number 5. This is the Zohar's comment on he drove out et ha'adam. Rabbi Elazar said, we do not know who divorced whom, if the Blessed Holy One divorced Adam or not. Okay, he's taking drive out as divorce. So we don't know who divorced whom. Did God divorce Adam, or what's the alternative? Adam divorced God. The Zohar doesn't want to say something so shocking. What does the Zohar say? Did God divorce Adam, or not? You see the beauty of the Zohar here. It makes you come up with a radical, almost heretical alternative. Right? Your mind can't help but fill in the gap, as a few of you just did. Did God divorce Adam, or, and your mind is thinking, Adam divorced God? Adam threw God out of the garden? The Zohar, being more innocent, just says, or not. That's the style of the Zohar. It doesn't hand you something on a platter. It makes you come up with a radical end of the thought. But the word is transposed, which I think really means the whole verse is turned on its head. He drove out et. In other words, don't put the period where it really should normally go. Don't put the period after he drove out et Adam. It's he drove out et, which now means what? He divorced Shekhinah. Who divorced Shekhinah? Then we read the next word, Adam. You see what he's doing to the verse? He's doing an impossible thing to the verse. He's putting a period after et. You can't possibly have a period after et, because et's whole purpose is just to introduce the following word. But he says, no, put a period after et. He drove out et. He divorced the Shekhinah. Who divorced Shekhinah? Now we read the following word, Adam. Adam actually drove out et. Notice he doesn't tell us that et means Shekhinah. I had to tell you that. 50 pages later, the Zohar will say, by the way, et is a code name for the Shekhinah. Okay, the Zohar is intentionally cryptic because it's teaching such radical things, such revolutionary new ideas. It's probably scared of criticism and censorship within the Jewish world or in the Christian world. So everything is hidden, everything is secret, everything is esoteric. Consequently, it's written, Yud-Heh-Vav Elohim expelled him from the Garden of Eden. Okay, the Zohar does not deny that God expelled Adam and Eve, but it says, why did he expel him? Because Adam drove out et, as we have explained. I love that, as we have explained. First of all, he didn't explain it. Second of all, when did he say it at all? One line earlier. But now all of a sudden, it's tradition. This I would call instant tradition. This is the Zohar style. Again, that new and ancient. Right? And Shekhinah specifically is new and ancient. Radically new idea, but recovering the ancient myth of the goddess. That's why the Zohar calls its teachings new ancient words. So this sounds intriguing, this sounds radical. What does he mean, Adam divorced Shekhinah? Maybe he means Adam should have contemplated the union of Shekhinah and her partner, her masculine spouse in the divine realm. Instead of uniting the two, Adam split them apart somehow. Or maybe it means he lost his own closeness with Shekhinah in the garden. Adam and Eve are in paradise, they're in bliss. Maybe he has union with the divine presence, and now he's split himself off from the divine. But I think it's best understood psychologically, because you really go back to the simple meaning of Genesis. I'm sure you've all read this story and heard this story dozens or hundreds of times. What does it mean that they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge? It's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but it's probably really a way of talking about their own awareness of self, their own self-consciousness. After all, what does it say? Adam and Eve were naked and they felt no shame. There was no self-consciousness until they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So what does it mean to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge? It really means to begin making distinctions. And what's the most basic human distinction? What's the first real distinction we learn to make? Somewhere around the age of 2. Mom, self and other. Self and mom. Until age 2, the baby doesn't distinguish itself from mother, or really from the world. You really could say every baby is a mystic. Every baby lives in this consciousness of oneness. And then we lose that. If we don't lose it, we're in trouble. Because you can't survive till the age of 3 or 5 or 10 unless you have a sense, I'm separate from that truck coming down the road or from the hot stove. Right? Why can't you leave a baby alone? Because the baby doesn't know where it ends and the world begins. So the baby doesn't make those distinctions. Adam and Eve were in that realm of total innocence, total naivete. You might say cosmic consciousness. Then they eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. They become aware of self and other. And that's not a sin, that's not a fall, that's just what happens. That happens to each of us. But you could say spirituality or mysticism is saying there's a great price we pay for losing that original sense of oneness. And mysticism is trying to recover at least some taste, some glimpse of that original oneness. So I think that psychological, mystical reading is also implied here. Questions or thoughts? You had a question?
Just a small Hebrew thing.
Yeah.
The et, and you've heard, I'm sure, that emet, meaning truth, is the beginning, middle, and the end.
Yes, and met as one more letter, the middle letter of the Torah. So you have Aleph, Mem, Tav, truth encompasses all. Yeah.
The Hebrew thing that I thought was interesting when you were talking about Ayin, Ani and Ayin. And
Yeah.
and the nun sofit being the end of nothing in Ayin.
It's a final letter.
The final letter, right? And Ani being singular, and just switching them, we have to change to a sofit, because it's the end.
Yeah, the middle letter becomes a final letter.
It's just Hebrewing with you.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of Kabbalah is, playing with Hebrew letters and the power of Hebrew letters, and every letter is a number, right?
Yeah.
Every letter is a number, so every word has a numerical value. A lot of that going on.
I wondered if there isn't a contradiction. You started out the talk by saying we can't understand God, the infinite. That's why we say it's nothing. And then it seems the rest of the talk was describing the thing that we can't understand, like male, feminine. It's every place that if we don't act ethically, we stop this infinite being from acting. So it seems like, to me, there's a contradiction between saying we can't understand it and then proceeding to define all these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, paradox, I think that there are profound paradoxes, and then they're more, problematical or just contradictions. And both are going on in Kabbalah. I think that reflects our own condition, our own state of mind. We live so much of our life in duality, right? There is me and you. There's here and there. There's male and female. There are these dualities, and then there are moments when we overcome duality. So I think mysticism is really how to negotiate between those two states of mind. Most of our life is going to be lived in that sense of boundaries and distinctions and differences. And then occasionally there's some breakthrough, there's some insight. And we can't live it totally in one realm or the other. We can't survive if we're just in oneness. We'd never get anything done. And I don't think we're satisfied if we live totally boxed within our ego self. So there's something inherently contradictory about the human condition. And you could say Kabbalah is reflecting on that. God is the oneness, but each of us is one little packet. Each of us is one little embodiment of the divine. And then when we discover it, those rare moments that we share something with another person, with another religion, with the whole universe. Einstein says it's a delusion. He says it's an optical delusion. He says delusion rather than illusion. It's an optical delusion to think that we're separate from the universe. Okay, this is not a wild-eyed mystic. This is the greatest scientist of the 20th century. Said it's an optical delusion to think that we're separate from the universe. We're really part of the universe. And he says that's the goal of religion, to remind us that we're part of the universe. So most of our life we're not aware of that. We live in a state of duality, and our language reflects that. Even our religious texts reflect that. And then you have moments of this oneness or this breakthrough. And if you try to make sense how they can fit together, it doesn't seem to make sense. But they both somehow reflect states of mind.
If I can just add to that, I think we're so used to the Greek system of logic that we assume this as truth. But logic is a construction as well. It is also a delusion. If this is so, that is also an illusion. And when we go to quantum physics, for instance, we find out that, in modern science, logic doesn't work, right? And yet we're all using the cell phones based on this illogical system of quantum physics and ideas. So I think for me, in the Kabbalah, it's a way to say there's something that you can't understand. If you'll understand it, you won't be yourself anymore. You can't be here and understand it, but to try to understand it is worth it. So even that process of trying is really the goal, in a way. Even if you never will get it.
Yeah, that's really good. If you really attain Ayin, you can't say, I got it. You're there, you're part of it. Yeah. You've melted into it. Then you can come back and you have some memory of it. And maybe something in us remembers an earlier time, an earlier state, when we were in the womb. Or maybe even, maybe back to the Big Bang.
Or the intuition, or whatever that is.
Intuition is a way to connect with something beyond logic. And paradox, for a scientist, paradox is a problem. If a scientist runs into a paradox, it has to be explained away. For the mystic or for the poet, paradox is a criterion of truth. Unless it's paradoxical, it's not true. Because the ultimate truth is Aleph, Mem, Tav. It's all of the letters. It's just everything. If something's really true, it has to somehow combine opposites. So it's beyond our normal categories of logic. And that's why mysticism is so hard to grapple with. You can't really understand it fully with the rational mind, but it's worth the effort because occasionally you'll transcend the rational mind. Yeah.
I think, just a comment, having your class, I know we talked about Ayin, there's some meditations we did on it, and the thought that, as soon as you sort of label something or categorize it, says something's wise, you've limited it, and we sort of, the whole concept of we're made in God's image, and these stories and these things that we're learning about God are really a reflection of our own conscious unfolding from birth.
Yeah.
And so, when you start saying, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm this, I'm that, I have a car, I have a job, you really limited and categorized yourself to where you sort of determined your future. But if you're here now, I'm none of those things. I'm just what I am at this moment. And if I dwell in that freedom, then I'm not all these experiences that formatted me or they made this thought of who myself is.
Right.
I can literally choose to go out of here or this next second to be whatever I want to be in a new way. And I think that when you think about touching the nothing, it is getting past all these things that we think we are and are gonna be, and these plans. I can choose to leave right now and go live under a bridge. I mean, that, and so that's the freedom. I don't know. That's the freedom of the nothingness and the reinvention and the paradox.
Right.
And able to sort of accept that wisdom and change now, because it's really.
It's beautiful.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Those are reflections of some of the things that you taught in class that sort of you talked again about today.
Yeah, I'll speak in a moment about this course. But what you say reminds me, one of the most beautiful names for Shekhinah is the secret of the possible. The Hebrew is Sod HaEfshar. She's called Sod HaEfshar, the secret of the possible. So she receives that emanation, she receives that flow from all the Sfirot, but the way in which she's going to express it is totally unpredictable. So that becoming a model for our own search for identity, our own sense of possibility within our lives. Takes you back to that beautiful name of God at the burning bush. Moses says, God, what's your name? God says, I am what I am. I am that I am. So God refuses to pin himself down. Right? I said that Ein Sof was invented by the Kabbalists, but there you have it already in the Bible, really hinted at. God refuses to put himself in a box. Let me just say a word about this online Zohar course, and then we can treat ourselves to a little wine and discussion. This is the last 2 pages describe it, and you can take a look at it on your own. I'll just say I began in January to teach Zohar online via Zoom. And a few of the people here in that course, there are people really all around the world. About 500 people have done one or another session of it. Right now there are 200 people completing this current series. What I do is teach for 6 weeks, 1 hour a week on Tuesday evenings, using Zoom from my home in Berkeley. And there are people in California, and the East Coast, and Israel, and Europe, and various places in Asia that are tuning in, some of them live and some watching on video. About 1/3 of the people participate on a typical Tuesday evening, and the other 2/3 watch videos at their leisure. What we're doing is going through the Zohar, this mystical commentary on the Torah, doing about 4 or 5 pages each week. I read and explain, and then I teach for about an hour, and then we have about 20 minutes discussion, question and answer. And during the week, there's a Facebook group I've created for the class, and there's lively discussion going on there. You don't need to know Hebrew or Bible or have background in Jewish texts, although there are rabbis in the course. There are, I think, about 40 rabbis, and then many more people who know little Hebrew or no Hebrew. They're Jews and Christians and Hindus involved in it. And there's a video of the very first session that anyone can watch. There's a YouTube link that's mentioned here around the middle of the first page of the description. So that's basically the description. A new session is beginning the beginning of July. If there are any questions about that specifically, feel free to ask now or when we talk informally. So thank you.
Just thank Danielle and continue speaking and asking questions. Thank you.
Great. You're welcome. Thank you.